All right. Door is closed. That's a signal that the panel is about to start, and also to start pumping in the gas. There is no escape. All right. Just so you know, I am running on extremely little sleep, so there's a decent chance I will make similar nonsensical jokes because I don't know any better right now. Welcome to Race, Redemption, and Revelation, Politics and Ethics in MMA Brotherhood. I'm Frobor. This will be my third panel of the weekend, and I've got one more tonight, one more tomorrow. We'll talk about that more at the end of the panel if anybody's interested. Before we get going, spoiler alert, this is an analysis panel, so I am going to assume you've seen the entire series. I'm not going to warn about spoilers again. I'm not going to recap anything. I'm just going to assume you know. So I'm gonna jump straight in. One of the big, FMA deals with a lot of potentially touchy issues in an actually pretty sophisticated way. And so I'm just going to jump straight in with probably the most obvious one, which is race. There is a lot in FMA about race and ethnicity, which we live in a multiracial society. To us, it's kind of obvious. There's a lot of different, races and a lot of different ethnicities and a lot of different cultures out there because we're surrounded by them. Especially this part of the country is one of the most diverse parts. But the U.S. as a whole is not just a very diverse country, an unusually diverse country. Japan is almost the polar opposite. If I remember correctly, Japan is 97% ethnic Japanese, 3% Korean, 0.0000000 something everyone else. And so they just have no, but there's very little need or opportunity in Japan to experience, and unless you're a traveler and go to different parts of the world, there's very little in Japan to experience multiple cultures or multiple races or multiple ethnicities. So quickly, what I mean when I'm saying ethnicity, in the US, when we talk about race, we mostly talk about physical appearance, mostly skin color, but that's not the complete story because, for example, we think of white people and Hispanic people as two different races when their coloration is very similar, but there's differences of history, there's differences of language, there's differences of religion, cultural differences, different styles of dress. All of these kind of combine to create an ethnicity. Much like the US, Full Metal Alchemist has multiple different ethnic groups defined by these factors. Amestris is a multi-ethnic nation, much like the US and much unlike Japan. Here we can see kind of an example of this. The reason Amestris is multi-ethnic is different from the reason the US is multi-ethnic. The US is multi-ethnic because mostly because people of lots of different ethnicities came here from other places. Amestris is multi-ethnic for the same reason ancient Rome was multi-ethnic. They started out as one tiny little city that conquered everything around it and basically forced all these different groups of people to blend and interact. So, for example, top row here, we have at least 2, possibly 3 different ethnicities. We normally think because Europe has kind of blended together European ancestry, especially in the US, but just in general, there's been a lot of mixing over European history. We tend to think of, white as this monolithic thing, but in actuality, you can identify, there's like in the US, there's people from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, there's people from Irish backgrounds, there's people from Italian backgrounds, and there's differences of appearance, differences of culture, and so forth. So I think it's possible that Trisha Elrich's ancestry and Winry's ancestry, just because of differences in the way they dress, differences in their coloration, it's possible they have, they came from 2 different peoples that were conquered by Amestris. Also possible they were not. Ed, on the other hand, we know his father is not. His father is the last survivor of Jing. Ed's half Zingese. He is from a different ethnic group than anyone else in Amestris except Al. Hi, Al. We also have here in the lower left Jerso, who looks, appearance-wise looks very different from the top row here. Much darker skin, broader features, kind of dreadlocks. You don't see a lot of people who look like that in Amestris, but there are a couple. And so kind of up for grabs whether he's descended from somebody Amestris conquered or descended from immigrants or something, but he's clearly comes from very different ancestry than the people, than the three people in the top row. But there don't seem to be any cultural barriers. There doesn't seem to be any racism between these groups. Case in point, because of her hair, I actually think Izumi is a mixture of Jerso's people and, Winry or Trisha's or somebody's, some other group within Amestris. Roy also, I suspect Roy is half Jingian. I'm sorry, that's right, Ed is from Xerxes. Roy, I suspect, is half Jingian, because if you put him next to Ling, they have the same coloration, they have the same eyes, which are very different from most other characters' eyes. They just look a lot alike, and I suspect they come from a similar group. What's important about this is that all these groups, they seem to get along. And the reason I think that they get along is basically because it's imposed on them. They've been conquered, they've been forcibly blended, they don't really have any other choice, and they all pretty much share identical culture. We don't see any evidence of these groups being from multiple cultures. But then we get another conquered group. All these other groups have basically adopted the Amestrian way of life. The Ishbalans have not. They do not integrate, which means while all these other groups of people, you can see they come from different ancestry, but they probably all think of themselves as Amestrian, and other people probably think of them all as Amestrian. Nobody ever refers to the Ishbalans as being Amestrian, even though ultimately there are people who are conquered by Amestris, just like all the other Amestrians. They are other, and othering is kind of the core of racism, of ethnic strife. Othering is the process by which you start out saying, that person is different from me. Okay, fine, that person is different from me. Everybody is different from me. All people are different. But then you say, that person, that group of people is different from regular people. I'm regular people. This other group clearly isn't. From there, it's a really easy step to go to not that group of people is different from regular people. That group is different from people. Now you're dividing between people and, well, Ishbalans. We're all Amestrians here, but not you. It leads to conflict. It leads to hate. It's much, much easier to hate someone, to hurt someone, to pass laws that discriminate against someone, so on and so forth. It's much easier to do that when you think of them as being other. In turn, the Ishbalans aren't going to take this sitting down. They're normally a peaceful people, but there's unrest because they're being oppressed. It creates a powder keg situation in which it's easy to spark, a major conflict. As we all know, the result of this conflict is that the Ishbalans get beaten down even harder. Now, you have a group of people who have everything taken from them, nothing to lose. They know they're not going to get a fair shake as long as this oppressive regime stands over them. They're going to fight back. And Scar especially, Scar is a terrorist. But because we see his side of it, which we normally don't do in stories that involve terrorists, because we get to see his side of it, we get to see why, what path led him to, what, events led him down this destructive path. Problem is, now you've got the Ishbalans, who are this alien other, and they're killing us. You don't see the whole, when somebody's, blowing up your alchemists, you're not going to say, well, yes, they're blowing up our alchemists, but there's this whole history of oppression. No, you're going to say, they're blowing up our alchemists. We need to stop them. So, cycle of violence that just continues and continues and continues. Now, of course, in this case, the cycle of violence has, there's somebody who's benefiting from it. When you've got this cycle of violence going on, people are afraid. When people are afraid, you can get them to do what you want. If you tell them, you'll keep them safe. There is a long history of people using racism to shore up their own power. This is just a handful of examples I thought of off the top of my head. History is full of these. From the Middle Ages through to basically World War II, in Eastern Europe, periodically, whoever was in power, the local lord, later, the local government, would whip up anti-Semitic hysteria to create these riots called pogroms. And the reason they did it was because as long as people were focused on hating their Jewish neighbors, they didn't complain so much about the taxes. They didn't complain so much about the fact that they had no rights. In the U.S., during World War II and in the decade or two after it, there was a lot of official and semi-official propaganda directed against Asians. If you go to superdickery.com, there's a lot of World War II era superhero comics involving unbelievably racist caricatures of mostly Japanese people, but also Chinese people, getting beaten up by Superman or Captain America or whatever. And in many countries, hysteria about immigrants. Outsiders coming in, taking our jobs, trying to change our culture. Immigrant hysteria is actually how Mussolini got to power. He used that fear of immigrants to create these anti-immigrant groups, anti-immigrant and anti-union groups that basically went around beating people up on behalf of large businesses, and rose to political, power over fascist Italy. And of course, this happens in Full Metal Alchemist. Amestris is using the Ishbal. First of all, Amestris is using, from the point of view of, the generals and so forth, they know the Ishbalans are scapegoats and they're using them, to maintain power and to gain power. From the point of view of Father, it's just a convenient way to get a lot of dead people to help power his alchemical circle. So